This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking with Jay Cost, who writes the Morning Jay column at the Weekly Standard. He's also the author of the new book, Spoiled Rotten, How the Politics of Patronage Corrupted the Once Noble Democratic Party and Now Threatens the American Republic. It's published by HarperCollins and available from Amazon.com and your local bookseller. And Jay, thanks for stopping by on this rather busy news day.
Well, thanks for having me, Ed. It's a real pleasure.
Jay, given that we're recording this interview on Thursday, June 28th, the day of the Supreme Court's rather taxing ruling on Obamacare, and given that you have an article on the topic at the Weekly Standard today, I have to start by asking, in your estimation, what did we witness today?
Well, I actually think this is a victory for conservatives. I think the corollary here the best one is perhaps the Marbury versus Madison ruling. In that case, the Chief Justice was sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, it seemed. He could side with President Jefferson and undercut the power of the Supreme Court, or he could rule against the president, risk the president not enforcing his ruling, and thus undercut the power of the court. Marshall found a third way through the maze. What he did was he sided with the President Jefferson, but in ways that expanded the power of the Supreme Court, things that Jefferson absolutely loathed, but was utterly powerless to stop. I think we have seen something similar today. I think what and this is primarily the doing of the Chief Justice, which makes it all the more interesting that this is basically the Chief Justice acting alone. What he has done is he's upheld Obamacare nominally. However, in upholding it, he has undercut two hugely important liberal legal arguments that have been percolating, frankly, for generations. He has said that the Commerce Clause has limits, even in regards the realm of economic activity, so to speak. He said that there has to be actual activity. There cannot be inactivity. And he has said that the Medicaid proposals were coercive of the states and thus violated state sovereignty. These are huge blows for the liberal movement, the progressive movement, which for a century has been working to chip away at the notion of limited government. Liberals don't believe in limited government. Liberals want to be rid of the concept of enumerated powers. They like the idea of unlimited powers for the federal government. They are, content with having the states, remain, but they do not like the idea of states' rights, or better put, state sovereignty. So these were huge defeats for the liberals today. But because the court nominally upheld Obamacare, we had Joe Biden out praising the court today, Nancy Pelosi praising the court today, and of course the president praising the court today. They really have no other choice. So it's really a victory, I think, for the conservative legal argument that has been, that our side has been pushing for generations.
So it's a bit of a poison pill, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's exactly right. And the important thing, too, is that, look, he's left Obamacare in place nominally, but come on. It is a tottering, teetering mess that looks like it's set to fall any second. And if anything, he's sort of given it a push in that direction by relabeling the mandate a tax, which is going to be a huge political problem for this president in November, and really makes it substantially easier for Republicans when they get back in charge of the government to get rid of it, because they can just really get most of it out of the way through the budget reconciliation process. Because it's tax, therefore it's a budgetary issue, and that's exactly what reconciliation was designed for. So he's made it easier, I think, for the political process to repeal Obamacare, even though he himself was not willing to do it through the legal process.
Jay, I definitely want to get to your new book. Spoiled Rotten is a history of the Democratic Party from its 19th century origins to its current form. Obviously, we could spend the whole interview discussing this, but in a nutshell, could you give us a sense of how it evolved from the party of reform to the party of special interests?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. What happened really, special interest politics has always been present in our system. I mean, it was what inspired the Democratic Party to form in the first place. Andrew Jackson thought that the government was cutting special deals to favored interests. But, as soon as, the Democrats took charge, they themselves created the spoils system, which basically did exactly the same thing. So it's really an endemic feature of our system. The argument of my book is that when Franklin Roosevelt took control of the government in 1933 and instituted the New Deal, we all think of the New Deal as this vast expansion in the powers of the federal government to manage the economy, which it was. But it was also a vast expansion in the ability of the government to deliver patronage to not just individual job seekers, as Jackson had done, but to whole classes of society. The Democrats sort of indicated they were prepared to use this new regulatory and redistributive set of powers to play favorites. And the argument of the book is that that's not a one-way street. When you start creating favored groups, those groups become part of the party itself. They become clients who eventually come to be in a position to demand more favorites. And the problem the Democrats have, in my opinion, is that over the years they've just accumulated so many client groups that whenever they get in charge of the government, the Democrats, that is, whenever the Democrats get in charge of the government, they are so overwhelmed by the demands of their client groups that they can't govern for the public good. And the book distinguishes between the good that particular interests or individuals might have and the good of everybody. And the argument of the book is that there's so many interest groups in that party that they cannot secure the public good.
The book spends a considerable amount of time discussing how the 1960s and the Carter era transformed liberalism.
The 1960s are really a crucial period because you see the addition of a whole set of new client groups in the 1960s. I mean, you have the environmentalist left, you have the feminist movement, the consumer rights movement. You also see African Americans join the political party, and while African American voters are not clients of the party, the Congressional Black Caucus functions very much as if it was a client of the party. And that is really the breaking point in the narrative, right? When you combine the old interest groups that had been in the party since the 1930s and sometimes even before, organized labor, the big city machines being the two principal ones. When you combine those groups with the groups from the 60s, it was just too much. It was the analogy I use in the book is that it's like a juggler who adds one too many balls to the routine only to see them all come crashing down. So the 60s is a very, very important moment in the history of the party.
Yeah, there was an article in the Weekly Standard a few years ago by James Piereson, whom I've interviewed on a few occasions, which called the New Left's post-1960s transformation of the New Deal era Democrats punitive liberalism.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think that's look, I mean, there's the 60s liberal groups, with the exception of African Americans who were very, very much focused on bread and butter issues. But the liberal groups of the 1960s that joined the party really were not. These tended to be relatively comfortable middle-class people who were motivated by quality of life issues like the environment or feminism, abortion, rather than, the sort of concerns that animated the old industrial unions, for instance, like wages and income and full employment and economic growth. And, a lot of they, in many cases, their interests were actually inimical to economic growth. And so in that sense, it is a kind of punitive liberalism is sort of, and a great example of this is one thing to talk about the type of environmentalism of Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot to sort of make sure that we don't, ruin the West and the beauty of the West with overdevelopment. It's another thing when we're talking about the Environmental Protection Agency being pushed by the environmentalist left to, regulate steel companies in my hometown of Pittsburgh to the point that they go out of business and throw, thousands of steel workers onto the unemployment rolls, which is exactly what happened with LTV Steel here in 1997.
In the 1990s, after initially tacking to the left, Bill Clinton, with the help of a Republican Congress, ran for re-election in 1996 as a relatively sane centrist president. The economy did extremely well during that period. But Al Gore ran for the White House as a hard left populist, as did his Democratic successors on the campaign trail in 2004 and 2008. How did the post-Clinton left manage to ignore all of Bill Clinton's successes?
Well, they don't view them as successes. I mean, as sort of the sort of the central point. I mean, they don't consider the balanced budgets of the mid 1990s successes. They view them as failures, as missed opportunities. Similarly, they view welfare reform as a failure. They don't view it as a success, and they think similarly of NAFTA. And that was the Gore candidacy is very interesting. It's actually a really critical element of the story I'm trying to tell, right, is that Clinton was freed from these left-wing interests after the Republicans took control of Congress, because they really dominate the party in the halls of Congress, particularly the House. So Clinton, after 94, they get cleaned out, and Clinton can deal with the Republicans, but they were so frustrated that the Nader candidacy was really built around mobilizing these groups, and it didn't work very well. However, it did force Gore to cater to them with that kind of populist rhetoric, which really undercut him with the middle of the country. And of course, even then, by tacking leftward, Nader still played the spoiler in 2000. I mean, the difference between a Gore victory and a Gore defeat was 537 votes in Florida, meaning that it's all on Ralph Nader, really. He was the spoiler that year. And his candidacy and the spoiler nature of that candidacy really reflected the widespread discontent of the left wing of the party. Even Democrats who ultimately ended up voting for Al Gore were still discontented. Nader was trying to channel their frustrations into a larger movement. He wasn't successful, but there was still that frustration.
How much of the rhetoric of contemporary liberalism, such as environmentalism and quote-unquote investing in America and stimulus and that, are just simply smokescreens for cronyism?
Well, the contention of the book is that that's exactly what it is, right? And that liberals are, and it's almost unfair to call these groups liberal, in the sense that liberalism, there is a liberal ideology that is really a very public-spirited ideology. The argument of the book is that the Democratic Party, liberal Democrats, are no longer capable of enacting this vision. But, look, what they do is they hide behind buzzwords that have a communitarian sort of undertone. Labor unions talk about working families. Well, come on, who can be against working families? Environmentalists talk about clean air. Again, who can be against clean air? I mean, but in fact, when you really drill it down, they're really promoting very narrow, very sectarian views, and these sorts of buzzwords are, exactly as you said, they're smokescreens.
The book's penultimate chapter is titled, "You're on the Menu." I kept waiting for the woman in the Twilight Zone episode to shout, "It's a cookbook!"
Right. Exactly. That's actually a reference to Tom Donahue, who is the head of the Chamber of Commerce, made that comment. He made that comment during the ObamaCare debate, and the full line was, "If you don't get in this game, you're on the menu." And he made that in reference to the fact that the Obama administration really represents a sort of apotheosis of this process of patronage-style politics in the Democratic Party. Every major bill that Obama and the congressional Democrats proposed, passed, supported, threw their weight behind, every one of them was dominated by political payoff to a wide assortment of groups, to groups that you usually think of as being Republicans, like the financial reform bill, for instance. I mean, but you move past all the bells and whistles. The reality was the big banks basically endorsed it. Why was that? Well, because the bill sanctified or legalized too big to fail, which is not a coincidence. The banks donated to Obama over McCain by about a margin of 2-1, and they got a very good return on their investment. In the health care bill, there were just scores of deals for the insurance companies, deals for the drug manufacturers, deals for the unions and the feminists. And the Democrats actually used this. They weren't subtle about it. Behind the scenes, they told these groups, look, if you don't want to get, your interest run over, you better cut a deal with us. I mean, this was them actually turning patronage-style politics into, an argument. It wasn't something that they were even embarrassed about. This was just, they were very open about it. They basically threatened these groups to come to the bargaining table or cut a deal. Otherwise, they risked getting nothing.
Jay, given the state of Democrats in general and the rulings today on both Obamacare and the Attorney General being found in contempt of Congress, what advice would you give Mitt Romney to fight back against Obama and his Democrats, this party of rent-seeking special interest groups?
Well, I'm not sure that any of this really is best, adjudicated on the campaign trail. I think that Romney's best bet when he on the campaign trail is to focus on bread and butter stuff. For instance, it's not just the economy, but when he's talking about Obamacare, he should focus on things like the gutting of Medicare Advantage, the fact that people are going to lose their health insurance even though they like it, the fact that, that costs are going to be much higher than originally advertised. He should really focus on the specific things like that. The real advice I would give Romney and congressional Republicans is the next time they get in charge of the government, they need to adjust their thinking. They need to, a perfect example, in my opinion, is the National Labor Relations Board. Every time the Republicans get in charge of the government, they appoint conservatives to the National Labor Relations Board, which is all well and good. But why don't they just get rid of the National Labor Relations Board? These are the sorts of things they need to start focusing on. Like any good patronage regime, the Democrats have access to federal revenue and regulatory incentives and so on and so forth, even when they don't control power. It's almost like an octopus whose tentacles are sort of attached to the government. The NLRB is a great example of that. The Republicans need to just start slicing away at these tentacles, and really that, I think, is the best solution for the future.
This is Ed Driscoll for PJ Media, and we've been talking with Jay Cost of the Weekly Standard, the author of the new book, Spoiled Rotten, How the Politics of Patronage Corrupted the Once Noble Democratic Party and Now Threatens the American Republic. It's published by HarperCollins and available from Amazon.com and your local bookseller. And Jay, thank you once again for stopping by.
Oh, thanks, Ed. It was my pleasure.